Okay, we're ready to start our EMS session. We'll now turn it over to Maureen Hager.
Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome you to our second preview session before the Economic Measurement Seminar. And those of you who may have not yet registered, tomorrow, Wednesday, August 4th, is the last day you can get the the early bird registration rate. So if you plan on going, do sign up tomorrow. So today's session is on seasonal adjustment. Seasonality is a common feature of economic data. And before COVID, it accounted for the majority of the variation in most economic indicators. Since we as economists always want to get to the real data, what they're really telling us, we depend on our statistical agencies to give us good seasonally adjusted figures. Those that remove all the predictable seasonal patterns. Removing seasonality is particularly important when it comes to identifying turning points. And our speaker today is an expert in that field. Atman Azil-Durham is Senior Director of Economics and Global Research at the Conference Board, where he specializes in development of business cycle indicators, the well-known US LEI, and forecasting aggregate economic activity. So his group not only produces the US LEI, it now produces LEIs for 12 other countries and the global economy. I know you have his bio with the materials, so I want to turn it over to Atman and get him started so we can take advantage of his time with us today. Atman.
Great, thank you, Maureen. Thanks for your introduction. Great to be here. Thanks to you and Nate for inviting me to this session. As you know, I can talk about business cycles and leading indicators all day long. And that's kind of my primary responsibility at the Conference Board. And if our viewers are not familiar with the Conference Board, they've certainly heard about the Consumer Confidence Index and the Leading Economic Index. So as a member-oriented think tank for over 100 years, the Conference Board has been not only using economic indicators to understand business and economic trends, but also it has been producing some of these indicators and contributing outlook and forecast discussions. So here you see some of the selected examples of the economic indicators that we produce at the Conference Board. And one of the main areas that we're using these indicators is to develop our US and global outlook and to really understand business cycles, expansions and contractions. And Maureen, you already mentioned we look at turning points in the business cycle. So within that context, I'm going to try to put seasonality and seasonal adjustment in that context as a user and producer of economic data. And the viewers, if they're attending the EMS coming up, they're going to be hearing a lot about economic data that's produced by government and non-governmental private agencies, and most of them are going to be asked to do or provide seasonally adjusted data. So we're going to spend quite a bit of time talking about why economic data are seasonally adjusted. Why is it so important why does it come up as a problem in business cycles? But that's not the only thing we're going to talk about today. We have divided up the hour into roughly 4 segments. And we'll spend a little bit of time on seasonal adjustment methods and methodologies. So that's not the purpose, the primary purpose for this session, to really go into a lot of methodological discussions, and I usually start with a caveat saying that, look, I'm not a seasonal adjustment time series expert. We have many experts on this at the Census Bureau and other statistical agencies. And in general, as producers of all this detailed data, they have spent a lot of time over the decades. Really, this is the culmination of sort of decades of work in this area to get seasonal adjustment right. But we will talk about what resources are available and what approaches can be taken. So I think it's important to keep in mind why we're doing seasonal adjustment, why is it so important, and put that in this context of business cycles before you go into the whole understanding of methodologies, because I think it really helps to get a better handle of those. We'll spend some time in the third segment about possible pitfalls in this work of seasonal adjustment. What are additional problems that might come up? And especially during this period that we're going through with the pandemic, recession, and the aftermath, a lot of economic modeling has suffered because of these unexpected movements. Are there other types of problems that might come up, and how has that affected seasonal adjustment? And at the end, we'll spend a little bit of time from the global perspective, and especially during the pandemic recession and recovery period, now that we know that the recession ended in April 2020. So before I launch into the first segment, maybe I can pause a little bit and see if there are any questions or comments. Please, you can type them in the chat box, and I'll refer to Maureen to share those with us along the way, and then we'll stop along the way.
Ottoman, you can go forward.
Great.
None so far.
So business cycles and seasonality. So I worked with Victor Zarnowitz when I started at the conference board. He's a scholar, he was a scholar of business cycles in the 21st century into this 20th century into 21st century. So over 50 years, really an academic scholar that's spending a lot of time thinking about these issues. And this quote goes to Victor, who spent all this time thinking about economic indicators, business cycle indicators. He says, in contrast to regular and predictable seasonal fluctuations that occur throughout the year, the economy undergoes these recurrent slumps that generate declines in sales, production, income, and employment. And along with rises in unemployment, and these are very important for policymakers, for the public, they're very costly for businesses when business cycle recessions happen. So it's important to be able to predict these types of recurrent slumps. But notice that he's making a very clear distinction between recurrence of those slumps and the regular and predictable seasonal fluctuations. And for those of you who are following business cycles and the NBER business cycle dating committee, those 4 indicators are the indicators that the committee relies on, along with GDP and some other data, to really identify when the business cycle ends, so the peak, and when the next expansion begins, the trough. And all of those series show these intra-year variations, and those variations, fluctuations, occur at about the same time. So say always in April or always in December. And therefore, they're going to be pretty predictable. And we can develop methodologies to deal with those. So these types of, the regularity is usually due to exogenous factors like weather and seasons, or it may be because of institutions and holidays. And you'll note I picked on April and December, and that wasn't by accident, because those are holidays in Europe and the US. Many Christian economies, nations usually exhibit those types of seasonal fluctuations. But the world is a big place. There are other seasonal holidays due to traditions and religions that come up. So these are exogenous factors. They're not occurring because of sort of some kind of underlying cyclical factor or cyclical force within the economy, which may be due to overinvestment, underinvestment, or mistakes in estimating demand levels, so inventory levels. So those are more endogenous factors. But when you look at the data, compare not seasonally adjusted and adjusted data, there could be a big difference. So these types of seasonal fluctuations can be a large portion of the variation that we see in economic data. So taking away seasonality is going to result in smoother data. Now, there are a couple of exceptions, and perhaps now, with the pandemic recession, we have another exception that proves the role. So an exogenous shock can cause a big fluctuation, but it's not predictable, and it's not predictable. In financial markets, many sort of stock price indexes, and interest rates don't tend to show a lot of seasonality, but you see seasonality in all sorts of other real economy data, in prices, consumer prices, producer prices. And seasonality is difficult to kind of incorporate into econometric models, where you're thinking about theoretical relationships or correlations between different variables because of this exogenous nature. So as business cycle researchers, we prefer to adjust and account for the predictable seasonality. And here you see an example of stock prices, where the fluctuations, it's very volatile, but they're not really caused by the seasonality in the data, but they're noise or other factors that are affecting stock prices. So let's take a moment and maybe digress a little bit, but this is again the center of business cycle analysis, where we're looking at economic data in a way in business cycle time, and we're looking at periods of expansions and periods of contractions. And those expansion and recession periods are identified usually by coincident indicators, those 4 indicators that we talked about. And we can look at those coincident indicators. The CEI refers to a coincident economic index. It will exhibit this recurrent expansion and recession periods, and we can demarcate them by a business cycle peak. The P refers to peak, and a business cycle trough, the end of the recession and beginning of the next expansion. And there you have the purple line, which helps us to identify those periods. So that's the shaded area that you see in this chart, right? So the recession period. Now, leading indicators also show peaks and troughs. And those peaks and troughs tend to come before business cycle peaks and troughs, as you see there. So there is a timing relationship, and usually the lead is shown with a minus sign. Here you have a minus 4 months peak ahead of the business cycle peak, and then a 2-month lead in front of the ahead of the business cycle trough. So this is a very abstracted and stylized view of the business cycle, and by its nature, it's the smoothness of the data helps me to talk to you about these periods of that are delineated by the peaks and troughs and alternating expansions and recessions. So with business cycle analysis, our aim is to be able to look at these types of alternating phases of the business cycle. And all economic theories exhibit that, except maybe financial indicators and stock prices, interest rates. But here you have a view of the business cycle indicators database divided into different categories. And wherever you look at, you're going to be seeing these seasonal patterns, which can obscure the commonality of the cyclical movements, right? So our aim is to get to those common movements that are not directly observed, and the seasonality in the data can obscure what the business cycle. Sorry, I'm having a problem with my screen. What the common movements can be obscured by the seasonality in the data. So in order to bring out those common movements and the turning points, and in order to monitor the business cycle in real time, we use composite indexes. And those composite indexes bring us close to a view of the business cycle of the economic data as you see here. It's not going to be as smooth and as stylized as this, but by using the composite indexes, we can summarize a lot of data into a more articulated view of the business cycle. So composite indexes naturally are made up of many components. The US leading index has 10 components. The coincident index has 4 components. And in all of those, almost all of those cases, those components are seasonally adjusted. And they're also deflated and volatility adjusted, and we're not going to get into that here, but the seasonal adjustment is a key first step in getting those components, combining them, aggregating them into the summary composite indexes. Those 10 components of the LEI come from a much larger pool of economic data, which is categorized here as you see. There are 15 different categories or groupings of economic data. And that's actually represents 270 or more individual series. And that larger pool is narrowed down to 10 components that are selected for their best performance or optimal performance to belong to that summary measure. So what selection criteria do we use to narrow down that field? There are 6 criterion that we use. You see them summarized here: economic significance, conformity to the cycle, consistency with the peaks and troughs, smoothness of the data, and statistical adequacy behind the way the data was collected and processed, currency and timeliness. Are there publication lags? So the reason I show you this slide is if you look at each of those criterion, each one can be affected by seasonality and ineffective seasonal adjustment. So if we get seasonal adjustment right, and a lot of the times we rely on statistical agencies, but that should be always a question that we should ask about the metadata about how is the seasonal adjustment done? Is it adequate? So seasonality is going to affect each of those criteria, and it is really therefore important for us to be able to get the summary measures so that we can do the business cycle analysis, so that we can track the economy in real time, We're not really concerned about the seasonal part of the movements that can be large. We're really concerned about the endogenous, non-seasonal a part of the business cycle. In order to get those summary measures, we need to be able to use seasonally adjusted data. So I also want to make a very quick note about business cycles and growth cycles. So it is important to make a distinction between business cycles. This is the classical definition of business cycles that the NBER follows. And these types of recurrent fluctuations happen in levels of economic activity. So levels of GDP show business cycles. Levels of employment show business cycles. We already kind of went through that stylized picture on the left side. There's another concept which became more important to look at, especially for emerging economies, but also during very long expansions. And that's growth cycles or growth rate cycles. In that case, we look at data after removing the long-term trend. So first we estimate a long-term trend, remove that from the actual level of the data, and we still get fluctuations, but now we call them growth cycle fluctuations. And those are also exhibiting these peaks and troughs. Leading indicators will, after detrending, will help to anticipate those peaks and troughs that you see there. But again, none of this is including the seasonality. And you can imagine if seasonality was present, it would really obscure where those peaks and troughs are. And finally, here's an example of non-adjusted versus adjusted data. So if we take non-farm employment, and if we look at the unadjusted NSA data, then you have the blue line, which, as you see, has a lot of fluctuations. It moves through recessions without any clear indication that the economy is in recession. So if you're living through this as a business economist in real time and you look at the NSA data, it's going to be very, very difficult to identify when the recession began and ended. There's already a lot of mixed signals and noise in the data. So we are going through these steps by seasonal adjustment, by smoothing the data to bring those out. And the smoother data, seasonally adjusted, it's not always this smooth. I think employment is kind of an exception because it is such a smooth variable. But the turning points in employment coincide much more precisely with the turning points in the shaded areas that you see there. Okay. Now, there is another way that you could look at the blue line, the NSA line. So at this point, if we were, meeting live, I would ask you, what could that be? How could you look at that data to smooth it? And the answer is by looking at year-over-year changes. So in many cases, you will see year-over-year changes, annual growth rates in data, in monthly data, in quarterly data, and that's going to take away that seasonality, especially if you do the year-over-year change, because April versus April last year, there's no seasonality. You're looking at a same-to-same comparison, apples to apples. So you could do that, and you will get very smooth data. And here in this chart, what I've done is I take the year-over-year change in both of those series, and you see they're smack on top of each other. But when you do that, what you end up doing is introducing a phase shift problem. The phase shift moves the data in such a way that the peaks don't coincide with the business cycle levels, classical business cycle peak. It gives you more of a view of the growth cycle peak. So that distortion can be problematic if you're trying to precisely estimate or predict the turning point of the recession or the expansion. monitor the economy in real time. When did the economy get out of recession? When is it time to take away economic stimulus that you're providing because of the recession? Are you keeping economic stimulus too long? So if you're looking at the year-over-year growth rates and data, that distorted phase shift view could distort your view and conclusions. So we looked at kind of smoothed, stylized views of the business cycle earlier, and we use summary composite indicators. And here you have the real world data, the leading economic index, along with the coincident economic index. And compared to their individual components, you see how much closer we are to the more stylized abstract view of the business cycle. They match much more closely with the shaded recession periods. And keep in mind, we're always using the seasonally adjusted data in the underlying components. So without that, it would be much harder to look at the data in this way. So is that a good point to see? We can pause and see if there are any questions, comments, or from you, Maureen, or any clarification questions as well.
Well, Ataman, I think you made a really important point. There are many economists who say they don't trust this seasonally adjusted data. So they use year-over-year percentage changes instead. And you really made clear why, if you really care about turning points, that is not a good decision. But given our time, I think we should move on to how do we do this?
Okay, so one more point about that stylized view of the business cycle. Once you have the composite indexes without the seasonality, then you can begin to make comparisons between different business cycles. And we'll come back to this towards the end as well. But we're comparing two periods. The 2009 aftermath of the great financial recession to an average profile of a recession recovery. So the light blue line is the average, and what happened is the darker blue line. The comparison is enabled by not just the summary measures, the composite indexes. If you looked at this with seasonality, it would look very, very different, and you wouldn't be able to more conclusively say that the aftermath of the Great Recession was much weaker than the average recession recovery periods. So we can do that with other indicators, and you can look at sort of the comparison of employment in different recession periods. And again, it's hard enough to do that, and without the seasonality, it would be it's facilitated by that. So how does a seasonal adjustment work? As I mentioned at the beginning, statisticians have been spending a lot of time and effort and sweat in developing methodologies for a seasonal adjustment. And there are lots of time series and econometric models, but underlying almost all of them is that the time series that we're observing is made up of three components. It can be decomposed into three components: the trend cycle, which is what we're interested in as business cycle researchers. There's a seasonal part, which is easily predicted, it's regular. And then there's the irregular part, which is really noise in the data that also can't be predicted, but it's not really significant or relevant for economic commercial activity. So we treat these unobserved components in the actual data and try to estimate the trend and the seasonal part of the data. Now, most of the methodologies look at here in the equations, y is output or employment or whatever, the unadjusted data. On the right side is the unobserved part, trend cycle, seasonal, and irregular. You'll hear about multiplicative and additive ways to estimate the different, decompose it into the different parts of the data. And essentially what you're doing is you're either multiplying the unobserved components together to get the actual data, or you're adding them together, and that affects how the seasonal factor is estimated. So for multiplicative adjustment, usually the NSA data is going to be divided or multiplied by a seasonal factor that's estimated through the use of moving averages, dummy variables that you can assign to different months, and so on. Same way, you could estimate the seasonal factors through an additive breakdown. And in that case, the seasonal factor is just going to be added to the data. In some cases, the factor is negative, right? So the increase in activity that you see in December in retail sales because of the Christmas holidays is going to be subtracted because it's not part of the business cycle. It's really part of a regular and predictable part of the data. So this is another example. So we looked at seasonally adjusted employment, which was very smooth, and the smoothness is part of the economic variable. It's really not because of just because of the seasonal adjustment. Here you see housing units started, and even after seasonal adjustment, you do see some volatility in the data. So it's seasonally adjusted data doesn't mean perfectly smooth data. Okay, so seasonal adjustment methods over the years, the census has developed X12 ARIMA, now it's X13. European statisticians have developed TREMO seats, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, signal extraction methods, varying degrees of using moving averages, long-term moving averages, and econometric time series methods. And there are also model-based approaches that rely on signal extraction and model selection and others, exponential smoothing, and so on. So I really would refer you to the sources directly to really learn more about that, ask questions about from the agencies. They provide a lot of background material on this. And many statistical packages already have built-in ways to do the seasonal adjustment, and you'll see that in some of the programs where you get your data as well. So not only do you see NSA and SA data, so it's important to look out for that. You can also do your own seasonal adjustment because in some cases, maybe you have a different view of how severe this winter was. Maybe this winter is not as severe as an average winter, and you think that that's going to distort the data that you're seeing from the agencies, and you want your own look. So you can kind of go in and use your own judgment on that. So that's another good place to maybe pause and see if there's any questions or comments.
Yes, actually, last year, we had a change with claims. We went from multiplicative to additive. Could you give us some insight into when you make a change like this, when you should use multiplicative, when should you use additive?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And generally with data that's showing sort of long-term trends and always has positive values, you're safe to use a multiplicative approach. And it does involve kind of taking logs of the data, and you can't do that with data that has negative observations. So that's one technical reason behind that, but it's usually applied to long-term trended data. Additive methods can be applied to any kind, but they're especially useful when you do see those negative values in your data, in your untrended data. So they can be helpful there. And if you like, we could talk more about the claims data, the unemployment insurance claims data. And that's a real world example where claims are always positive, right? There's always a finite number of people, hopefully, that are unemployed or are asking for unemployment claims. Unfortunately, it's not zero. And multiplicative adjustment was used by the BLS. But because of the pandemic distortion in the data that created a huge, unprecedented fluctuation, the multiplicative estimated seasonal factors were creating more of a problem than they solved, right? So it was deemed that the additive method was going to give us a more reliable estimate of the seasonally adjusted data. I think after some years pass, there's still going to be a lot of research done in this area to see, exactly what happened. So we'll have to wait for the dust to settle for a bit before we really have a clear view of, what seasonal adjustments did during that period. And we might expect, more than the normal level of revisions for some more years to come.
Well, actually, with claims, we adopted additive to follow the BLS. Well, BLS does the factors for the Department of Labor, and it's fine for the national. But all of a sudden this spring, we found we were getting negative claims for certain states. So it doesn't always work.
Yeah. So I think
clearly there are some issues to consider.
Yeah.
Looking at some questions that are coming in here, how do you decide whether you include all the data or only a portion of the data in your seasonal adjustment?
So until more recently, the sort of standard practice was to seasonally adjust the most recent data for some years at the end of the sample. And that introduced some stability into the data so that the history didn't change very much, because by seasonally adjusting the data, you're introducing this estimation, possibly errors. So that was a standard practice. However, more recently, the best practice, the sort of gold standard, has really shifted because the seasonal adjustment methods have improved. The underlying adjustment method is so much better now compared to X11 that doing the seasonal adjustment for the full history of data is less problematic. So because of that improvement, I think the standard practice has become to apply it to the full history of the data. I think most of the methodologies will require you to use at least 3 years of data. And if you have computational limits, you could be limited to apply only 3 years of data for the seasonal adjustment and keep the history fixed. That was the old methodology, and now the standard practice is to do I believe it's still the full sample period.
So now, in fact, the statistical agencies are doing concurrent seasonal adjustment. So can you explain how that differs from how it was done previously, where seasonal factors only changed once a year?
Yeah. Again, part of the practice was to take the history of the data at a given point during the year and benchmark it. And when you're doing benchmarking, you're introducing more complete sources of data and making methodological improvements. And part of the methodological improvements would be to estimate or re-estimate a new set of seasonal factors. And at that time, you would estimate or forecast for the next 12 months until the next benchmark a set of seasonal factors. And those then will be used until the next benchmark when you have more revised data, more up-to-date data where you can kind of redo the exercise. But again, now, we're not constrained by computational limits, and the better practice is to do seasonal adjustment. As soon as you get new data, you add 1 month of data, you can re-estimate the factors instead of relying on seasonal factors that may have been estimated 6 months ago. So this is a way to kind of introduce newer revised data more frequently without having to wait in between benchmark periods. So I hope that makes sense. Oh, you just got muted, Maureen.
I apologize. Does it bother you at all that statistical agencies put out a few data points when indeed the entire series or all the data points that went into their analysis potentially changed?
So if I understand the question correctly, is it a problem or does it bother us if the whole history changes?
The Census Bureau will give us, say, the last 3 months of data and a year ago, but those intervening data points changed. I presume if they don't change very much, it doesn't matter very much, but I was just interested in your opinion.
Yeah. So again, I think it does depend on it's an empirical question of the size of the revision that's introduced by this. Most of the time we think of history, the past, as unchanging, right? So it's happened, we lived through it, and it shouldn't change by some estimation method. And if you are using a kind of a solid, robust method, that's not going to happen very much. And it could be problematic if that view changes a lot, if those revisions are large, because earlier we were talking about the turning points, right? So if the turning point is in February 2020, but now purely as a result of the adjustment methodology, not because of some fundamental reason underlying the data, but purely because of the methodology, your peak is not February, but in March, it sort of revamps the history, and that could be problematic. I usually take a very data-driven empirical view to these things, and I look at is the revisions introduced by the methodology small enough, and is the methodology sound and robust? So that's my answer. So obviously in 1960, the peak probably shouldn't change as a result of a purely methodological adjustment.
Okay, let's move along because I know you have a few more slides here.
Yeah, so we've already started talking about some of these pitfalls. So the questions were great, so keep them coming. I just added a few slides in terms of what could be some of the issues that come up because of these methodologies where we are doing a seasonal adjustment estimating those factors through coefficients, and then adjusting the data. And we could be introducing dynamic relationships that are not there, right? So all of a sudden, two different series that aren't really related look like they are related because of the seasonal adjustment. So that's the methodology creating a problem for the interpretation or analysis of the data. But on the other hand, if you don't apply the methodology to adjust for seasonality, then you could be seeing spurious relationships that shouldn't really be there. Because two series increase in December because of seasonality in the data, doesn't necessarily mean they are fundamentally or theoretically related to each other. So one way to get over this might be to make sure that the seasonal adjustment filter methodology is the same for all the variables. So you're kind of putting them through the same machine, and then you're comparing apples to apples at the end. So you want to watch out for these overstatements or understatements of the relationship between two variables. In many cases, we want to look at real variables versus nominal variables. So we go through the deflation using price indexes. In this case, you're using a producer price index to deflate long-term loans in China. And the use of which price index you're using is very important. And the deflation also could give you different views of the data. And in this case, the old methodology that I'm referring to here was creating these regular movements that look very seasonal versus the new methodology for deflating with the PPI. Different PPIs were used. So those are some caveats to watch out for. And we should also watch out for moving holidays, right? So especially for Chinese New Year, but also things like Ramadan and other Middle Eastern holidays. You might have the calendar year, the calendar months might be different from the holiday period. So Chinese New Year often falls at the end of January or early February, and depending on that, the regular predictable fluctuation that you see is going to fall on a different week. And now there are methods to adjust for that, but it's something to watch out for, and the adjustment may not be as perfect or complete as you expect it to be if you're not intentionally adjusting for that part of the data. So that distortion in real time can be very important. So here you see again weekly hours, adjusted and unadjusted versions before and after and during the great financial recession in 2008-2009. Now, this is a better example because the recession we just went through is really because of an exogenous event, right? So it's not part of the business cycle movement that's inherent in these series. So that's why I'm looking back at the great financial recession crisis period. So seasonality in the data can distort the strength of the recovery or the weakness as you're heading into the recession. And then the adjustment in the blue line helps you to see that better. So if we look at the June 2009 was the end of that recession, right? So look at the end of the shaded area. Average weekly hours, seasonally adjusted, is still falling. But if you're looking at the unadjusted data, you would have seen this increase, which might have led you to think that, oh, hours are increasing, we've already recovered. But no, it was a much more weaker labor market that really raised questions about where that end of the recession was and the strength of the recovery. Again, real time, we're not going to go into this too much, but there are already revisions in the data that we're using anyway, because more complete information is coming into being. The underlying data is being revised for the most recent few observations. So if you look at real-time data, it does give you mixed signals about the strength of the recession or recovery or expansion anyway. And if we don't account for the seasonality in the data, we might have additional problems in making more accurate assessments. So there are consequences for real-time analysis, current monitoring of the economy, and we should watch out for those. But we have kind of, as the questions I think also illustrated, the estimation of seasonal factors can introduce estimation errors, and that's something else to watch out for. Generally, as good practice, I would suggest looking at both NSA and SA data. If there are doubts, ask additional questions and maybe try your own seasonal adjustment to kind of really unearth what's going on. The revisions could be increased. The size of the revisions could also be increased because of those estimations. And there are things like incomplete seasonality or moving seasonality that creep into the data if it's not done correctly. So again, those are caveat as you're using the seasonally adjusted data in real time. So one way to check might be you take a seasonally adjusted variable, apply seasonal adjustments again to it. So the result should be almost identical, if not identical, to the original data, right? So the seasonal adjustment that you've gone through is for nothing, but that's just for checking to make sure that it is fully seasonally adjusted. And if there is a problem, that it might come up through that double seasonal adjustment methodology as a checking method. So, but I do recommend kind of looking at the NSA and SA data in concurrent analysis to make sure that the estimation of the data, seasonal factors, that's relying on historical patterns is really suitable for the current data that you're looking at. So you heard me say that while this winter was milder than the average winter, but the seasonal factor is relying on the average winter that was going on in the last 2 decades. So that could be climate change creating problems for our seasonal adjustment. So that's another good place to stop as we're coming to the end. I think I only have 3 slides left. Any questions or comments?
Well, one of the things that has been observed is you can add up several seasonally adjusted series and end up with an aggregate that has a lot of residual seasonality. So in the case of some foreign GDPs where they don't seasonally adjust their data, people will adjust overall GDP and then maybe 3 of the 4 major components and sort of leave the 4th as a residual. What do you think of that approach?
So in our work in the global business cycles, the international comparability of data is very important, and you're raising a very crucial aspect of those international comparisons. So it's important to make sure that the seasonal adjustment is done on a comparable basis, that it follows the sort of international best practices in doing that. And then the other issue you're raising is that, complex variables like GDP have, very many pieces. Those pieces also sufficiently or appropriately seasonally adjusted? And if not, does that create kind of a problem for comparability? So are you really applying the apples to apples comparisons? And the answer is it's really empirical and it's going to change case by case. But I think those are important questions to address.
You have some European countries that use tremo seats like Eurostat uses tremo seats for the EU. And I think that's primarily to do a lot of data very easily. But so do you then choose to use tremo seats, or do you redo these other countries using X13 REMA seats? How do you approach that?
Yeah. So in general, those two X13 and tremo seats are sort of internationally accepted methodologies. Most often, they'll result in sort of similar adjustments. Of course, case by case, there could be differences. So that's a caveat in making those comparisons. You know, a few years ago, I might have said that X13 is probably the gold standard. The Census Bureau has, spent decades in, and they continue to spend a lot of effort on this, right? That in the U.S. And tremo seats, it has made a lot of advances and is more, econometric based in a way. More time series based, so it does have some appealing aspects, and it could be personal preference, your sort of econometric sophistication, but they have made a lot of advances to make them comparable, I think. So given the caveat of comparisons, international comparisons, apples to apples, especially if you're going to use US and European data, I probably am not too worried about it. But if you do kind of get into comparisons with emerging economies where the data quality is not so good anyway, the problems that creep in might be worse. So there is an added benefit. So I would give more weight to making sure that you are using sort of the same filter on both of those types of series.
For example, for China, do you use real GDP seasonally adjusted by NBS?
We're doing our own seasonal adjustments.
Yeah,
the conference boards.
Okay.
We're using X13, and in that case, the answer is X13.
Yeah. I think you may have one or two more slides, and I think we're running out of time. So let me just ask you to conclude.
Sure. So I really have only 3 more slides, but in conclusion, we talked a lot about international comparisons. So that was a good segue actually into one of the last charts. We talked about international comparisons and comparisons over time with different business cycle episodes. So that's facilitated by seasonal adjustments, as well as the global international comparisons. Here we've aggregated the leading indicators together into groupings of mature economies, emerging economies, and then a global LEI. Again, you're seeing a much more smoother view of the business cycle compared to what the underlying component data would give you and the unadjusted data would give you. So that's a good place to end. Here's some summary, which is kind of going over everything that we've been talking about. If we can predict it, let's remove it so we can bring out the regular endogenous part of the business cycle. Focused on the trend and cycle part of the data rather than the irregular noise or the seasonal aspect. But given how important real-time analysis is monitoring the economy, it is an important feature of the data that we use to be able to understand the past cycle and predict the future cycle. And these are always, the methodologies are always being improved upon. So it's important to kind of keep some tabs on what the Census Bureau or the Eurostat is doing in terms of their methodologies and ask for the best and the latest seasonal adjustments. And thank you for your attention. Thanks for having me.
Ataman, thank you very much. And for the rest of you, I'd like to just make sure you're aware on the program of the EMS, we're going to have another session on some of the complexities of seasonal adjustment during COVID. And again, tomorrow, deadline for early registration, and then the seminar starts Monday, August 9th.